In the 1940s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a couple of newsletters or short essays about the purpose of education. I want to go over one of them. It's pretty short, and it's something that I give all of my students in whatever class I'm teaching to help give them a broader perspective on the purpose of education. Keep in mind that he wrote this in 1947, so this is over 70 years ago, because some of the things that he says about the purpose of education and people's misunderstandings about the purpose of education still apply today, more than 70 years later. In fact, I think what he has to say about the purpose of education is even more important today than it was then, and you'll see why. He says, "As I engage in the so-called bull sessions around and about the school, I too often find that most college men have a misconception of the purpose of education. Most of the brethren think that education should equip them with the proper instruments of exploitation so that they can forever trample over the masses. Still others think that education should furnish them with noble ends rather than a means to an end." So this is the first paragraph. At first he says, "As I engage in the so-called bull sessions around and about the school." So a bull session was just an informal discussion among college students about things like politics or religion or the issues of the day. So as he's going around and about the school and getting engaged in these conversations people are having, what he called bull sessions, he realizes that as far as he's concerned, a lot of the students had a misconception about the purpose of education, why they were in college to begin with. And he points out two differing views that he often saw. One of them had to do with exploitation and trampling over the masses, which is a really harsh and odd-sounding way to describe a person's view. The other one focuses on what he calls noble ends, E-N-D-S, like the end of something. So what are these two views? The first view, he says, most of the brethren think that education should equip them with the proper instruments of exploitation to forever trample over the masses. This view of education is similar to the view that you go to school so that you can obtain knowledge and therefore gain power and money and status over and above all the others in the world. That people who go to college have some sort of understanding about the world that gives them access and resources to trample over the masses, to oppress people. Now, this is some harsh language he's using. It's often used of, tyrants or slave oppressors. But he really is saying that many of them believe that the reason that they are in college and the purpose of the college is to help them understand the world in such a way that they have power, authority, and status over it in some way, which other people who haven't gone to college, they just don't have that kind of power, authority, and status. The other view of education, he says, still others think that education should furnish them with noble ends rather than a means to an end. So first of all, what is an end, E-N-D? How is he using that word? You can think of him using the word ends like a goal, something to work towards. So he's saying that some people see education as a means towards some noble goal. What are those goals? Well, he doesn't specify here. He's just saying that there is some noble end for which a person goes to school. And by using the word noble, he's distinguishing it from the previous understanding of education, which is acquiring knowledge to gain power and money and status. This view of education he's talking about now sees education as providing us with something virtuous, courageous, valuable, something intrinsically valuable, something good in and of itself. As I read this article, he's gonna discard the first one, the one that sees education as a means to exploitation, but he is going to hold on to the idea that education does provide you with the instruments towards something. There is a usefulness to college that still remains. And he's going to really focus on the second one, but he's going to add a twist to it. This twist has to do with what education does for our mind and our character. He goes on and says, "It seems to me that education has a twofold function to perform in the life of man and in society. The one is utility, and the other is culture. Education must enable a man to become more efficient, to achieve with increasing facility the legitimate goals of life. So remember, he just said there are two views of education he often sees. One sees it as a means to exploitation. One sees it as a means toward noble ends, right? So he's elaborating a little bit more on that second version. He does think that education should enable us to achieve the legitimate goals of life, and those would be our noble ends. But he starts off by saying there are two functions. One is utility and the other is culture. Now, utility, you can think of it just like a utility belt. A utility just means something useful, right? So one thing school ought to do is provide for us something useful. That's a given, right? We all already assume that. But one of the conclusions he draws is that most education is only focused on the usefulness aspect of it. And usually the usefulness aspect of it is focused on acquiring money, status, and power. But there's another one. The other function of education has to do with culture. That is, education should enable us to flourish. It should enable us to get along in society, to contribute toward the cultures that we live in, and to learn from the cultures that we live in. So there's this aspect of first utility, usefulness, like getting a job, making money, and then there's this aspect of culture. It should also help us understand our own culture and contribute towards it. And when he means culture, he's going to mean it in a much broader perspective than just like the American culture. But he's going to mean it in something like human culture and plural, human cultures. But it's the last sentence in this paragraph that he's going to elaborate on, where he says, education must enable a man to become more efficient to achieving with increasing facility the legitimate goals of life. Efficiency, increasing facility. Education is supposed to help us achieve our goals better, and not just any goals, but the legitimate goals of life, which I think he's also associating with noble, virtuous ends. Now listen to all the different ways he describes what education should do for the mind, because his focus here now is on the intellect, the mind, our rationality and reason. He says, education must also train one for quick, resolute, and effective thinking. Quick, resolute, and effective thinking. To think incisively and to think for oneself is very difficult. We are prone to let our mental life become invaded by legions of half-truths, prejudices, and propaganda. At this point, I often wonder whether or not education is fulfilling its purpose. A great majority of the so-called educated people do not think logically and scientifically. Even the press, the classroom, the platform, and the pulpit in many instances do not give us objective and unbiased truths. To save man from the morass of propaganda, in my opinion, is one of the chief aims of education. Education must enable one to sift and weigh evidence, discern the true from the false, the real from the unreal, and facts from fiction. Now that puts a lot of weight on what education is supposed to help us do with regard to our mind. And this is really crucial, I think, because it is not the case today that many schools, whether it's, K through 12 high schools or community colleges or universities, put a lot of emphasis on things like critical thinking. But the whole weight of his paragraph here is to say education should do a lot for our thinking. It must enable us to think quickly, resolutely, efficiently, incisively, autonomously. He doesn't say the word autonomous. What he says is to think for oneself, right? And that's just to say that we ought to be autonomous in our thinking. He says that many people who are educated don't think logically, scientifically, right? So thinking logically and scientifically are other ways that we ought to be thinking. And he says several different things. The press, right? The classroom, the platform, the pulpit. Now think about this. This is in 1947, and he's talking about the press, right? It's not like they had 100 different newspapers, 100 different TV channels and news stations, and they certainly didn't have the internet. So we're talking about, when he means the press, this is a very limited number of press outlets, right? So you might have CBS, NBC, and ABC, right? You might have the New York Times and the Washington Post. You didn't have a whole lot of media sources like we do today. And he's saying that grouping, the press, doesn't always give us unbiased, objective truths. He says the classroom doesn't either, right? The educational institutions don't do this. He says the platform, so political platforms, the politicians, they're not giving us true and unbiased, objective truths either. And he says, and even the pulpit. Now, the pulpit was the place from which a person would preach the gospel, right? So Martin Luther King was a Christian, and a pastor. So for him, that was actually pretty important. And he's even acknowledging that even pastors don't always give us objective, unbiased truths. And he says, to save man from the morass of propaganda, the propaganda from pastors, politicians, even teachers in the university, and especially the press. To save us from all that drama is one of the things education ought to do. Keep in mind, this is 70 years ago. Today, we've had cable TV since, the 80s with a big satellite dish. We have hundreds of channels. But on the internet, there are thousands, tens of thousands of news outlets. And anybody on the internet can start a YouTube channel and become a journalist, right? You don't need to watch ABC or Fox News. You can watch some other person report on the news and decide that that person has it legit, that they're telling the truth. So back then, they didn't have nearly as many opportunities to see all these different news outlets like we do today. And that's one of the reasons I think that critical thinking is even more crucial today than it was back then. And we're even seeing that. With, for example, COVID. When COVID first started, and even now, everybody was all confused about what they ought to believe about it, what scientists to believe, because scientists were disagreeing, politicians were disagreeing. Nobody understood how to sift and weigh evidence, discern true from false, fact from fiction, real from unreal. And that's a crucial part of education. Now he comes to an important part that I think all of us can recognize. He says, the function of education, therefore, is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. But education which stops with efficiency may prove the greatest menace to society. The most dangerous criminal may be the man gifted with reason, but with no morals. That is really important. So he just said, education is supposed to help us think in all these different ways, sift and weigh evidence, discern true from false, real from unreal, fact from fiction. So therefore, it's supposed to help us think intensively and critically. But there's a huge stop there. And he says, if that's as far as it goes, that's all it's doing, then education may end up becoming the greatest menace to society, because the most dangerous criminal is the one who is educated, gifted with reason, but has no morals. Now, how many of us have seen that in the penitentiary? There are men that are very intelligent, whether you mean high IQ, or sometimes you even have somebody in prison with a really solid education. Maybe they had bachelor's, master's, PhD. Or maybe there's just guys in there that are very well read. They've been down a long time. They've been reading all these books and literature. They're really smart, book smart, right? And yet they can be the most devious people. They can commit crimes more efficiently, better, because they're smarter, more educated. And he thinks that this component, whereby education should also inform our moral principles, and he's going to end up saying our moral character, was really lacking in the 1940s. 70 years later, what do you think is the problem? I mean, do we think that college and education really promotes moral living and moral values today? I think the situation is worse than it was 70 years ago. So I can only imagine what he would think about the educational system today. Then he gives an example of a person, a former governor of Georgia. He says, the late Eugene Talmadge, in my opinion, possessed one of the better minds of Georgia or even America. Moreover, he wore the Phi Beta Kappa key. By all measuring rods, Mr. Talmadge could think critically and insensively, yet he contends that I am an inferior being. Are those the types of men we call educated? So this is really interesting that Dr. King points to someone. He points to someone who believed that Dr. King himself was an inferior being, but he acknowledges this dude is smart, all right? He's smart, and he has the Phi Beta Kappa key, or he has these academic credentials as somebody who is very intelligent, very well educated, and yet he has this particular view of human beings that is immoral. He thinks some human beings are inferior on the basis of their skin color. And he says, do we call men like that educated? And by educated, he really means genuinely educated, truly educated. Now, he asks the question, but it's really what they call a rhetorical question. He thinks when people are reading this, when people hear this, their immediate answer will be no. No, we do not consider people like that genuinely educated. People like that, there's something wrong in their character. They may be able to think critically, intensively, efficiently, but there's something else wrong. There's something misfiring there. And as far as he's concerned, it has to do with their moral values and foundation. And for someone to think that Dr. Martin Luther King was inferior on the basis of his skin color was a ridiculous, irrational, immoral idea. Then he starts to draw to a close and he says, we must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. The complete education gives one not only the power of concentration, but worthy objectives upon which to concentrate, right? So it gives you the power to concentrate, to think critically, intensively, sift and weigh evidence, but it also gives you noble ends or worthy objectives upon which to focus, study, and concentrate. The broad education will therefore transmit to one not only the accumulated knowledge of the race, but also the accumulated experience of social living. Now, when he uses the word race here, he means human race. Education will enable us to understand the accumulated knowledge of the human race. So, for example, things like science, and also the accumulated experience of social living. We'll also understand our culture, tradition, morals, and values better. But I think that is really key when he focuses on character. It's something I have in the bottom of all my emails. In fact, when I graduated for my doctorate degree, a friend of mine had a plaque made over here that is that very quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. We must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. And he ends this by saying, if we are not careful, our colleges will produce a group of closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists, consumed with immoral acts. Be careful, brethren. Be careful, teachers. Now, if you go back through this article and just review these things, he really does believe that when we think and speak and promote ideas, we should be logical, rational. We should depend on science for things, but we ought to also be moral and virtuous. He connects our mind with our hearts, our intellect with our morals. And he saw in 1947 that many people didn't understand that, and that many schools were not actually promoting that other half, which was character. I'd like to use one more example, which is from an essay he wrote a few months before the one that we just went over. He gives an illustration where he says, education without morals is like a ship without a compass, merely wandering nowhere. It is not enough to have the power of concentration, but we must have worthy objectives upon which to concentrate. He already said that in the one we're doing. It is not enough to know truth, but we must love truth and sacrifice for it. Merely knowing things with our mind is not enough. We must love the truth and sacrifice for it. And I think that is exactly what he did with his own life.